This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 32 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, we will be looking at players in Week 8 that you should not be afraid to start. Now, on last week's episode, our hit rate was pretty good here. We targeted Kirk Cousins. We talked about the Bears' backfield. At the wide receiver position, we talked about Jacoby Myers, Terry McLaurin, Rashee Rice, Josh Downs. All those players had very good fantasy performances in Week 7, and in fact, one of those players we're going to double down again in Week 8. Now, there are no teams on buys this week, so that does afford us a lot of depth at the position, especially at wide receiver and tight end, but my rules for this episode remain the same. We are targeting quarterbacks and tight ends outside the top 10 in the weekly ranking, and then outside the top 20 at running back and wide receiver. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show. We are on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. And you can also email the show any questions and comments at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now, my one quarterback recommendation this week outside the top 10 is going to be just outside the top 10, and that is Joe Burrow at quarterback 11 currently, according to ESPN's Week 8 rankings. Now, Burrow only has one game so far this year where he has exceeded 20 fantasy points, and he only has one other where he broke 15 fantasy points. However, he was clearly injured at the beginning of the season due to his calf injury, and I think he has looked healthier and more mobile since Week 5. And the Bengals are coming off a bye week. Furthermore, Joe Burrow is getting a healthy T. Higgins back in the lineup too. Now, on paper, the Niners are a bad matchup for opposing quarterbacks. They've given up the third fewest points to opposing quarterbacks so far this year. However, I noted last week the reason I liked Kirk Cousins against San Francisco was because opponents frequently find themselves in negative game scripts, increasing their pass volume. Opposing quarterbacks are averaging 40 pass attempts a game, and I expect Burrow to have ample volume in this contest, and if he can avoid multiple turnovers, he will have a solid fantasy outing similar to what Kirk Cousins did last week. Now, ESPN ranks Burrow as quarterback 11 as of Thursday morning's recording, but I would place Burrow at quarterback 7 on the Week 8 rankings. Now, for the running back position, last week I talked about the Bears' backfield, and I'm going to talk about it again because we should be targeting the Bears' backfield for another start here in Week 8. Now, there's two options. Roschon Johnson is at running back 32, and D'Onta Foreman is at running back 33. Now, the reason I like the Bears for the last week or so has been two reasons. In neutral and positive game scripts, the Bears have been giving their starting running back strong RB1 usage. It has been less of a committee situation and tended to be more towards the starter. And on top of that, the running back unit is more fantasy relevant when Justin Fields is out of the lineup. And it already sounds like Fields is doubtful for Week 8. Now, D'Onta Foreman had an awesome Week 7. He had 3 total touchdowns. He had 33 fantasy points. However, rookie Roschon Johnson returned to practice yesterday after missing the last 2 weeks. Johnson was ahead of Foreman on the depth chart prior to the injury. Both players are ranked next to one another currently in the Week 8 rankings. Again, Johnson, running back 32, Foreman, running back 33. And there's just uncertainty in the market right now on which running back to prioritize for Week 8, which is why they are ranked side by side. However, continue to watch reports throughout the week and up to Sunday morning. As of now, I would place my wager on Roschon Johnson getting the start, but that's subject to change based on his health. If you are holding either Johnson or Foreman, and the reports come in Sunday morning that your player is getting the start, then I would confidently insert that player into my starting lineup. Another backfield and player with injury question marks is the Cleveland backfield, and specifically we'll target Kareem Hunt, who is currently running back 25 on the Week 8 rankings. Now, this recommendation is based on the expectation that Jerome Ford will miss Week 8 with the ankle injury, and Kareem Hunt will not only start, but he will be getting a strong majority of the starting snaps. Now, both Ford and Hunt did not practice on Wednesday. Again, I'm recording this on Thursday morning. Now, Hunt has back-to-back games over 15 fantasy points, even though he barely played half the snaps in those contests. The Browns have 32 rushing attempts in the last 2 games coming out of the bye week, and the 2 games prior to their bye week in weeks 3 and 4, they averaged only 24 rushing attempts. The Browns have been more run-heavy with Watson out of the lineup, and the running back unit is still consistently averaging about 15% target share on the season too. That has not changed. Now, we'll cross our fingers that Hunt is healthy enough to play through his injury on Sunday, but assuming so, I like Hunt as a strong streaming option outside the top 20 that will finish inside the top 20 in Week 8. And then my last option is going to be Texans running back Dameon Pierce, currently running back 28. Now, look, I admit this is going to be a dangerous recommendation because I typically like to target the player and not the matchup. But this is a matchup recommendation entirely. The Texans, coming off a bye week, are in Carolina, and the Panthers have been terrible against the run this year. Not only are the Panthers last in rushing EPA, which is expected points against, but they are last by a wide margin. Now, Dameon Pierce has been a borderline bust so far this year. He's running back 31 on the season with only 2 double-digit fantasy games so far this year. Furthermore, all of his performance and advanced metrics are down compared to last year. Pierce has clearly struggled to adapt to the new offensive scheme. So much so that in Week 6, prior to their bye week, Devin Singletary had his highest snap participation of the season at 54%, and he outsnapped Dameon Pierce for the first time this year. The Texans also used Singletary to close out the game. He played 9 of 13 snaps in the fourth quarter compared to 2 for Pierce. And Singletary's metrics, while not great, are better than Pierce's so far this season. But based on the matchup, I would be okay placing Pierce in my lineup this week if needed, hoping for the Texans to get into a positive game script with Pierce getting back his majority snap share over Singletary. Now let's pivot and talk about the wide receiver position and last week's breakout player, Jordan Addison. He finished last week as the wide receiver 1 on the week with over 30 fantasy points, yet he is ranked wide receiver 21 in the Week 8 rankings. Now, I've noted for multiple weeks now that the Vikings lead the league in passing attempts, yards, and touchdowns. In fact, the Vikings do not even have a single rushing touchdown on the season yet. And the Vikings have the widest disparity in average number of passing attempts per game compared to rushing attempts. They are averaging almost 20 more passing attempts per game than rushing attempts. That's the widest disparity in the league. Not only did Addison have a 24% target share and a 41% share of air yards in Week 7, but he did it on only a 75% snap participation because he was out of the lineup for the portion of the game. His snap and route participation should increase on Sunday. Addison is ranked outside the top 20, but he should be well inside the top 20 every week now as long as Justin Jefferson remains out. Our next option at wide receiver 26 is going to be Jaguars wide receiver Christian Kirk. Now, excluding Week 1, Christian Kirk's target share is leading the team at 26% compared to only 18% for Calvin Ridley. And as pointed out by Hayden Winks on Twitter, Kirk's targets are closer to the line of scrimmage and more likely to be over the middle of the field. And this explains why Kirk's average depth of target is 5 yards less and his catch rate is 15 percentage points higher than Calvin Ridley. Nonetheless, Kirk has consistently been between 14 and 22 fantasy points for 6 straight weeks now. On top of that, the Jags are in Pittsburgh, who have given up the second most points to opposing wide receivers on the season. Our third recommendation this week outside the top 20 is going to be Bengals receiver T. Higgins, who is currently wide receiver 29. Now, Higgins has been a bust for fantasy up till this point. Now, he had one game in Week 2 where he was near 30 fantasy points, but his other performances this season have either been busts or non-relevant due to injury. However, coming off the bye week, the expectation is that T. Higgins will be back to his typical snap and route participation. Keep in mind, in weeks 1 through 3, when healthy, Higgins had 28 total targets. He was averaging over 9 targets a game. And last year, minus week 18, when T. Higgins played at least 75% of snaps, he averaged over 18 fantasy points a game. And like I mentioned with Joe Burrow, even though the Bengals are playing San Francisco on Sunday, opposing wide receivers typically do pretty well against the Niners because their opponents have to increase their pass volume in a negative game script against San Francisco. and that typically bodes well for opposing wide receivers. And then our last recommendation this week is going to be Colts wide receiver Josh Downs. Now, I recommended Josh Downs last week when he was outside the top 40 at the position ranking, and again, I'm going to do it this week. He's currently wide receiver 44. Now, he delivered last week with 23.5 fantasy points. That marks 3 straight games where Downs has had a double-digit fantasy point game. Furthermore, he has 3 games this year with a target share above 25% and a target per route run rate above 27%. All 3 of those games have come with Gardner Minshew at quarterback. And then lastly, at the tight end position, I got one recommendation this week, and that is going to be Cowboys tight end Jake Ferguson, currently tight end 12. Now, this is going to be a combination of a player who is on the rise and has a great matchup. First, let's talk about the matchup. The Rams rank near the bottom of the league in opposing points to tight ends. Now, as for Jake Ferguson, he has typically been very good on small samples dating back to last year and through the early part of this season. He has just needed more snaps. Now, prior to Week 6, Ferguson was second on the team in targets, even though he was playing with a limited snap participation. But that is on the rise. Since Week 4, Ferguson's snap participation has climbed from 56% to 69% to a career high 86% in Week 6. And if Ferguson can combine his Week 6 snap participation with his early season target rate, combined with a favorable opponent, this could be your breakout player of the week. Now, if you're looking deeper at the tight end position and need more of a desperation dart throw, I would recommend Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals, currently listed as tight end 20 on the week. Zach Ertz has been placed on IR. The last few weeks, McBride and Ertz have been splitting snaps, but McBride should see a solid bump in snaps, routes, and likely targets now. And on a per route basis, and again, I will caution you due to the smaller sample size of him being a backup to start the year, but on a per route basis, McBride is 5th in the league at his position in target rate. He is 4th in yards per route run, and according to PFF receiving grade, he is 9th. And on top of that, he has a 24% target share this year on plays without Zach Ertz on the field. And then lastly, last year, McBride averaged over 10 points a game after their Week 13 bye when Ertz finished the year on IR. So that will wrap up episode 32 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back next week with multiple episodes. We'll look at waiver wire claims ahead of Week 9. We'll do a full recap with key observations from around the league in Week 8. And we'll look ahead at players you should not be afraid to start in Week 9. So 3 episodes a week. Make sure to like and subscribe. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.